Good day and welcome from Dartmoor in England. Imagine a runner trying to win a marathon with their shoelaces tied together. After 26 miles, they collapse and the crowd mocks them for being out of shape. That is the reality of the Cuban embargo. While the world watches a record-breaking 10% of the population flee the island, the largest exodus since the Cold War. So are we witnessing the failure of an ideology or the success of a siege? Today, we're diving into Donald's Monroe Doctrine and the reality of Cuba's blockade by the US. There are two sides to this, and first we're going to take the point of view of the US government. Why does the blockade exist? Why should it not be removed? Then we'll take the standpoint of the Cuban government. Whether you want to call it communist, a dictatorship, or an authoritarian regime, or a people's democracy, it's up to you. But just to give you a flavour of how intense this debate is, I've been struck by the sheer venom directed at anyone who even suggests that El Bloqueo might be unfair to the Cuban people. My recent video on Mexico and Russia's efforts to bypass the blockade drew comments such as these.
Lots of misinformation from an uneducated moron. He gave the Russians permission, yeah.
Fuck communist. The end is near, assholes.
You are one hateful prick.
It's a bunch of nonsense. The embargo has no effect on the Cuban people.
You know the UN condemns the Cuba blockade every year?
Yeah, that's bullshit.
Coming back to planet Earth, what exactly is the US perspective? Let's look at 4 of the main stated reasons why the Cuba blockade is in place. Firstly, when Fidel Castro took power in 1959 after a 3-year guerrilla war against the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, there followed a period of nationalization of American refineries and assets, including sugar mills, telephone and electric companies, and banks. Also, confiscation of large estates, many of which were owned by American companies or wealthy Cubans. 55,000 small businesses were also nationalized. The US maintains that the blockade should stay, and the American companies and families are compensated. So the US and many individuals are still nursing a deep-rooted resentment stretching back almost 70 years. Secondly, again going back in history, the disastrous 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion by 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and funded by the CIA suffered a total defeat. Eisenhower's plan, authorized by John F. Kennedy, was to spark a popular uprising among the Cuban people and replace Castro with a pro-Western government. The idea of the US destabilizing foreign governments for its own purposes is hardly a surprise, such as the 1953 coup in Iran or the 1954 coup in Guatemala, or more recently Ukraine 2014 and Iran again 2026. It could be that the continuing blockade is seen by many as retribution for bloodying the nose of US interests in the Bay of Pigs at that time. The third argument is that of strategic necessity. In Venezuela and Cuba, the US utilizes maximum pressure campaigns, combining crippling economic sanctions with support for internal opposition to dismantle socialist governments that defy American influence in the Western Hemisphere. For Washington, a Cuba that partners with Russia and China is a direct threat to the Western Hemisphere. In their view, the blockade isn't bullying, it's a necessary defense against an undemocratic neighbour that refuses to play the American game plan. Even the 29 proposal to purchase or invade Greenland is viewed by analysts as a modern expression of the Monroe Doctrine, or these days Trump's Monroe Doctrine, aimed at securing Arctic shipping and rare earth minerals while preempting Chinese and Russian influence in the North Atlantic. Finally, number 4 is the Cuban regime is repressive and is overseen by Raul Castro, The 2019 Constitution explicitly reaffirms that the Communist Party is the only legal political party and that the socialist system is irrevocable. Economic control is in the hands of Gaisa, the military-run arm, ensuring that even should the economy open up, ultimate financial and physical power will remain with the revolutionary elite. We are pointed to suppression of dissent, such as the 2021 protest of July the 11th, 2021, which were met with a severe crackdown. Hundreds of participants received long prison sentences. So the argument is that by cutting off the Cuban government's access to global markets, you weaken their grip on power and force them to improve human rights and offer free elections to their people. Now let's switch to Cuba's counter-argument under the heading of sovereignty versus imperialism. The perspective of the government is that the nationalizations of 1959 to 1960 were not theft but a legal assertion of national sovereignty. Under Batista, the US owned 70% of Cuba's arable land and almost all its utilities. The tax liability for refineries was negligible. From this perspective, the blockade, it's not about compensation, but a refusal by the US to accept a truly independent neighbour that chose a different social and economic path. The second point is asymmetric warfare, the genocidal argument.
The only way to undercut Castro's support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. A line of action which denies money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of government.
That quote is from the Mallory Memo from the US State Department, 1960. Cuba officially refers to the blockade as el bloqueo, the siege, rather than embargo. They argue that by preventing the purchase of food, fuel, and even medical equipment containing more than 10% of US parts, the US is engaging in a form of asymmetric warfare. They claim the goal is not democracy, but to intentionally create misery so that the population will eventually revolt, a strategy they describe as a violation of international law. Because the US classifies Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, most international banks refuse to process any transaction involving the island. They fear over-compliance penalties, massive fines from the Treasury, if even a single cent is traced to a sanctioned Cuban entity. This has effectively unplugged Cuba from the global SWIFT banking network. Number 3 is the double standard. The Cuban standpoint often highlights what they see as US hypocrisy. They ask, why is Cuba sanctioned for its lack of free elections while the US maintains deep strategic and military ties with absolute monarchies and other authoritarian regimes? They argue that the state sponsor of terrorism designation, a political fiction used to block Cuba from the international banking system, making it nearly impossible for them to pay for the basic imports or even to receive money from abroad. Other countries such as China and Vietnam have followed a similar socialist path, and that has led to both economic success and a high level of international integration. As for repression, is it any wonder that such authority is necessary in order to combat the unrelenting interference and subversion of its people by US institutions intent on destabilization? The Cuban government highlights its social achievements. Despite being a developing nation under siege, Cuba's achieved a literacy rate of 99.9% and established a healthcare system that provides universal coverage as a human right, not a commodity. Even in 2024, Cuba's infant mortality rate remains lower than that of many wealthier nations in the Americas, and its life expectancy at over 78 years rivals that of the United States. The irony is that the very people the state spent so much to educate and keep healthy, its doctors, engineers, and teachers, are the ones now making up that 10% exodus to the United States and Europe, Perhaps the most modern success is Cuba's biotechnology sector. It is the only country in Latin America to have developed and manufactured its own COVID vaccines, such as Abdala and Soberana, and it continues to produce over 60% of its own essential medicines. Furthermore, through its medical brigades, Cuba exports its healthcare expertise to dozens of countries, viewing its doctors as its most valuable ambassadors. For the government, these aren't just statistics. They are the conquests of the revolution that the blockade has failed to dismantle. And of course, while some parts of the system are a success on paper, the lack of supplies like syringes, basic aspirin, paper for schools is currently making these successes harder to feel on the ground for everyday Cubans. Now, let's debunk 3 of the most common claims put forward by pro-embargo supporters. I was sent 2 videos by people wanting to educate me. Here's the first video.
They decided to invest in tourism even when tourism numbers were declining in the country since 2020. How much did they put into the famous education and the famous healthcare? Well, less than 3% of their budget.
The argument is that because the government spends more on tourism than healthcare, it is in some way incompetent. But tourism isn't just a policy choice. It's one of the few ways Cuba can earn foreign currency under sanctions. Without dollars or foreign currency, Cuba can't import fuel, can't buy medicine, can't sustain the infrastructure. Critics point to hotel construction while hospitals lack aspirin, but they ignore the catch-22. Without the hotel revenue, there is no hard currency to buy the aspirin in the first place. It is an economic trap, not just a policy failure. So tourism isn't wasteful, it's survival. Criticising Cuba for investing in tourism while ignoring the restrictions that force that reliance is, well, it's incomplete at best. The second video I was sent with the intention of shutting me up compared Singapore with Cuba. Look at Singapore's success compared with Cuba's hardship.
La diferencia entre Singapur y Cuba es abismal. Singapur está en el puesto número 1 mundial, es decir, es la economía más libre del planeta. Cuba, por el contrario, está en el puesto número 175, solo por delante de Corea del Norte.
Singapore's success was built on being the world's ultimate middleman. They sit on the world's busiest shipping lane, showered with Western investment, and plugged directly into the heart of the US financial system. It's been downhill all the way for 60 years. Now imagine if Singapore had been hit with a total US naval blockade in 1962, if they were banned from the World Bank, cut off from the US dollar and sanctioned by every ship that docked in their harbours. Singapore wouldn't be the shining city that it is. It would be a silent rock in the ocean. Comparing a country that is globally embraced to one that has been systematically unplugged from the world economy for 6 decades isn't an analysis. It's like strangling someone, then criticising them for having difficulty breathing. And as mentioned, there are numerous autocratic nations around the world that by most measures can be seen as being economically successful. Then there's the argument that the embargo and sanctions are written into US law by the 1996 Helms-Burton Act. And that's true. However, while successive presidents suspended Title III of the Act until 2019, the Trump administration has doubled down, leading to increased litigation against foreign companies. As the Helms-Burton Act is law, Congress could vote to set it aside, though it would require a majority or even a supermajority. Because Florida is a key swing state, politicians fear a backlash, even though opinion is split amongst the Cuban diaspora. And even after an appeal vote, the president could then veto the whole thing. With hardliner Marco Rubio whispering in Trump's ear, there seems little chance of any change in the law. But President Trump did just engage with the US in an Iran war without Congress approval. Trump did just allow a Russian tanker to dock in Cuba. For sure, Trump could suspend elements of Helms-Burton and take significant steps to ease the pressure on Cuba. 165 UN countries oppose Helms-Burton, And in the US, while the country remains divided, 61% of Americans now favour engagement against 32% favouring strict isolation mandated by the Helms-Burton Act. As regards Cuban-American diaspora support, the picture has changed over the years. The most hardline blockade supporters tend to be in the older age groups, and those opposed to it in the younger age bracket. The most frustrating part of the 60-year debate is we can't turn the clock back. Pro-embargo supporters point to Cuba's crumbling infrastructure and say, see, socialism fails. But they are judging a runner who has been sprinting for 6 decades with their shoelaces tied together. The Cuban government has never been given a single day of free rein to flourish, to trade, or to fail on its own results. We don't know if their model would provide a paradise or a disaster in a free market because the US has never allowed that experiment to take place. So when people argue that it's just a bad government, a bunch of dangerous commies, they're making a claim they can never actually prove. You can't accurately diagnose a patient while you're actively cutting off their oxygen. If the goal is truly to prove that the Cuban system doesn't work, then why not lift the blockade and let the world see? Until then, el bloqueo isn't just a policy, it's a permanent excuse that prevents us from ever seeing the truth of what Cuba and the Cuban people can be. To wrap up, I will add my own thought as someone looking in from the outside and who has yet to visit Cuba. People don't hate Cuba, but some people's obsessive hate of communism and Castro and desire to force democracy on Cuba quite overrides the point that the quality of life for Cubans has been diminished for over 60 years. Where do we go from here? Another 60 years of sanctions? President Trump was elected on the basis of the President of Peace. We have yet to see it. Wouldn't it be incredible if the US and Cuba could put idealistic differences to one side, develop friendly relations, and just take it from there?